Mesdames et Messieurs,
Chairman of the Commissions, Members of Parliament, dear colleagues, it's a great honor for me, on behalf of Richard Ferrand, to wish you a warm welcome to this first interparliamentary conference organized by the National Assembly in the context of the French presidency of the European Union. It's a great honor as well, because for 6 months, Europe is at the very heart of our national debate. It is for us, and particularly for parliamentarians who are a link between the Senate and the European specialists and our citizens, to give a better understanding of what the Union is, how it can serve to protect us against new major risks at a time when Europe, notwithstanding its efforts, is pushed to the forefront of the international scene. A sine qua non condition for the survival and economy of the future is in space. Applications in space are growing constantly every day, and in the long run could cover all human activity. I'm thinking of energy management through surveillance of climate warming, development of new modes of transport with global positioning systems for all vehicles, increasing digitalization of the economy and connected objects, and also defense activities. I'm very keen to hear your contributions, and I'm sure that this will be a very fruitful and original discussion full of ideas. I think it's in dialogue and discussion that we can move things forward together, and that we will have the opportunity to see what Europe can do. And in this way, we can, with enthusiasm, serve the interests of our European citizens. I'd like to thank you and hand over at this stage to Mr. Lescure, who will be chairing this session. Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank you in person for everything you have done to organize these conferences. You've been working at it for several months to allow the French presidency of the European Union to be one that concerns parliaments, and it shows that national parliaments do have a role to play in Europe. And in this way, we're getting to grips with very important subjects that are going to dictate the future of Europe and the world in the coming weeks, months, years, and decades. This afternoon, we'll be talking about space, and I think we can talk in terms of decades. I'm delighted that behind us we've got the Ukrainian flag, which means that I can take the opportunity to acknowledge the courage of the Ukrainian people in Kiev and elsewhere, and express our solidarity with them. Presidents, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, in the 1960s, Sputnik was not the name of a vaccination nor of a dubious news outlet. It was part of a space program. It was a space program, and together with the Western version Apollo, it had become the symbol of the space race. It was also the theater for the rivalries. Today, in a world where unfortunately we seem to be going back to the future, global space competition does clearly seem to have been turned on its head. For several years now, it has been China carrying out the highest number of launches in the world, 52 in 2021. In other words, it is the global space leader, ahead of the United States, which posted 43 launches in 2021. Last year, it was Iran that had announced a successful launch of Simorgh. Globalization of space is now a reality. We've also seen over the last few years another form of space competition, and this time an economic competition. Last year, there was space tourism that hit the headlines, largely through American private companies, Blue Origin, SpaceX. And in July of last year, Jeff Bezos, the founder of Blue Origin, was on board his own launcher that had come out of the factories belonging to his group and launched from his own spaceport in Florida. So aside from those events that hit the headlines, the space applications are going to grow and will cover pretty well all human activities. And I'm sure that with the representatives here in the room and on the screen, we'll be hearing about some very striking examples, not just from China, Iran, or the US, but also France and Europe. So aside from these economic projects, there'll be space applications that will grow, covering pretty well all human activity, management of energy through the surveillance of climate warming, development of new modes of transport through GPS systems, digitalization of the economy. We can literally talk in terms of there being new space, a new space economy that is emerging, and we can evaluate the likely economic impact at several hundreds of billions of dollars. The President Macron recalled in Toulouse on the 16th of February that we have come to a real turning point for Europe. There is the dream that has always been there when we're talking about exploratory missions, but the economic reality of the new space markets cannot be denied. It's a question of urgency that very quickly we show that we can be independent in communications and application solutions based on the internet. Here it has to be said that SpaceX and Blue Origin already have their own satellite constellations, Starlink and Kuiper. Europe is going to have to roll out its own constellation very quickly if it wants to retain its sovereignty. With this in mind, efforts deployed by the European Commission in the person of Thierry Breton, the Commissioner. I'd like to welcome him. Unfortunately, he can't be with us for obvious reasons, although he had planned to be here. These efforts are extremely encouraging because the EU is going to contribute some 2.6 billion euros, which is 40% of the predicted forecast cost of the program. The European Union has extremely talented engineers and researchers. Mobilization of industry around these new projects has to be total. Space Europe can already count on the traditional players, Airbus, Thales, OHB Systems in Germany. It has also to include the myriad of SMEs and startups that are starting to emerge in this sector, and they have to be involved in a logic around European solidarity. Perhaps there have to be organized channels based on solidarity and collective work, and we're convinced that this is going to be vital if we're not to leave everything in the hands of the Americans and Chinese. Obviously, France is going to play a major role here in the definition of a European strategy of new space, and I hope that the discussions in the course of the afternoon will make it possible for us to make a contribution. So, colleagues, before we get down to business, I'd like to hand over to the chair of the Finance Committee of the Senate, Claude Raynal, who I think is on the screen. You have the floor, sir.
Il est connecté. Claude Raynal, est-ce que vous pouvez...
Claude Raynal, if you could unmute your microphone and take the floor, please. So before we conquer space, we need to conquer the screen, because otherwise, Chairman, perhaps, Françoise, you would like to say something. Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure for me to be with you this afternoon to discuss a highly strategic issue, which is space. For a number of years now, this has been undergoing a significant revolution. For a long time, space was a new frontier. Now, we can say that it's a new front that has to be defended, and here I use the same terms used by the Minister, Florence Parly. Spain is part and parcel of strategic competition at global level, which brings us back to the situation that we had during the Cold War. Admittedly, the militarization of space is not something new. For decades now, Earth observation resources, telecommunications, etc., have been rolled out in space, and these are essential as support mechanisms for our armies. The weaponization of space, in other words, sending into orbit military capability, is a relatively recent process, and it is a source of major concern for our armed forces. The powers are developing in space defensive capabilities, but also offensive capabilities such as we've never had through cybernetics, electromagnetics, and kinetics that are becoming increasingly sophisticated as time goes by. This capability is likely to weaken our space infrastructure, which is so important for our armed forces as it is for the civilian population. So this boosting of capability goes hand in hand with a certain amount of irresponsible behavior from our competitors, such as we have seen in the case of the Russian anti-satellite launch in November 2021. There's no denying that the competitors want to benefit from the legal vacuum that exists concerning the use made of space for military purposes. We have a tragedy in Ukraine, and this means that we're extremely worried about the possibility of a highly intensive global conflict. There's no doubt, though, that space will also be a place for confrontation in the same way as air and sea will. So our armed forces are actively preparing for such an eventuality, as we've seen with the second edition of the Space War of Aster X, which began on the 22nd of February and brings together French, German, and Italian soldiers. As a result, the real challenge for us in Europe in the future is to preserve our freedom of access and action in a space that is becoming increasingly competitive, congested, and militarized. In the face of these threats and the risk of further conflict, we must have a European response. We must develop a real European space strategy around three major objectives. First of all, strengthening the resilience of our space infrastructures in the face of the risk of aggression. Secondly, develop synergies in terms of our capability so that we can constitute a real European space market, both civilian and military in nature. Lastly, work on the development of good practices and standards so that space is regulated and safe. These are huge challenges, and they require not just strong political mobilization at European level, but also a huge investment for industry, and that means both for the civilian and military domains. I'm firmly convinced that in space, far more than in other areas, the dichotomy between civil and military is unfounded. Capability development for Europe in areas such as in-orbit services, space situational awareness, launchers, will serve the interests of civilian populations and our armed forces. Similarly, the major problem of space traffic management, which was the subject of a joint communication on the 15th of February from the European Commission and the European Service for External Action, concerns both the civilian domain and the military. In a context where we're seeing an intensification of space traffic and an increase in the quantity of space debris, traffic regulation is indeed crucial if we're to protect our military infrastructures. That is why we want this conference to deal not just with the challenges linked to new space, but also the challenges pertaining to defense, because the two are irrevocably linked. So I'm looking forward to hearing your contributions, and I'm sure that you would agree that these are vital issues for our collective security and safety, and I think that is particularly true as we see what is happening currently. Thank you for your attention. I give the floor back to the President, Mr. Lescure. I'm very happy to take it. And I think very quickly, I can now hand over to the President of the Finance Committee from the Senate, who is now switched on. So over to you. Well, I hope you can hear me. Yes, indeed. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for your invitation, allowing me to attend this parliamentary conference. I apologize for the absence of Sophie Prima, who's the chair of the Economic Affairs Commission of the Senate, and she's asked me to represent her. We welcome the choice of this subject for the conference. Space innovation is part and parcel of the directions identified by our space monitoring group. In the face of international competition and the return of the spirit of space conquest, and we've heard a very clear statement to this effect by the president in Toulouse, and facing the increase in the number of launch pads and national industrial projects, foreign companies' innovations, which are constantly bringing down the cost of access to space. In the face of all of this, it is essential to support the progress that can be made by our startups, our SMEs, and very small companies. Investing in new space means that we can stimulate innovation within the context of industrial ecosystems that have been existing for a long time, with significant economic players supported by institutional orders. In France, this is what the government has chosen to do with the announcement of a project called Maya Space, where there's construction of a reusable micro-launcher, and that has gone to Ariane Group. In parallel, there are promises for investment in 3 French startups, which will be developing reusable micro-launchers and engines. This twofold track is taking a look at the capability of the young startups to develop these demonstrators and then industrialize them. But this is essential in order to stimulate competition and innovation in a sector which not so long ago was deemed to be a state monopoly. Investing in new space means also encouraging the funding of young companies, spreading the spirit of entrepreneurial mindset and the culture of risk in the space sector. Access to external funding is decisive at the initial stages, but what is important is to allow these young companies to get contracts from the powers that be from large companies. This is vital if they are to become truly industrialized and to succeed. We mustn't be overly naive. The success of SpaceX is based to a large extent on public orders and state support. Investing in new space means encouraging the establishment of innovative and incubator ecosystems. I think it's still possible to make real progress here. The creation of Take the Moon incubator, working together with the CNES, is something that we see as highly promising, particularly in a context where there's an increasing interest in space exploration and human spaceflight. As regards all of these challenges that have been mentioned in the context of new space, we would hope to have some answers from some of the participants. And let me say that I appreciate the fact that they've made themselves available and look forward to hearing from them. Mr. Lescure, I'd like to give you the floor.
Thank you, dear Chair. We'll now go on to our guests, who I would like to warmly thank all of them for being here. As we all know, we were originally planning to meet up together in Toulouse, a city which is highly symbolic of the sector we're interested in, and also a very beautiful French city, which I would encourage you to visit if you haven't done so. Impossible. We are here in Paris, some of us, and the rest of you, of course, in other places in Europe. Let me also repeat Thierry Breton's very sincere apologies. He wanted to be with us, but because of current events, had to go to the Baltic states, where he will be spending the entire day. So let me suggest that we now hear from Bruno Le Maire, current chair of the ECOFIN Council, our Minister of Economy and Finance. I spent all day with him yesterday. He is very occupied by Ukrainian matters, but he also wanted to have his video heard. He is the present chair of ECOFIN and our minister, as I have said. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be able to speak today to talk about what is at stake in the aerospace sector, the new challenges, and our common defense. I would like to have a special word for Roland Lescure, Chair of the Economic Affairs Committee, and I'd like to thank you all for your commitment. Let me also say a very specific word of support to the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian president, and the Ukrainian nation, who are confronted with unprecedented events in the history of the construction of Europe. The crisis between Russia and Ukraine bears witness to this. Europe must become independent, strategically, militarily, and also in space, so as to exist in the 21st century. The first 2 decades of this century taught us something. We cannot have political independence without technological independence and spatial independence. Our economic prosperity depends on this, as does our military power, and the defense of our political and democratic values, which are the most essential to us. Space power today is an extension of political power and economic and military power of the great nations of this world. That's the reason for which, together with the President of the French Republic, we wanted space to be one of the major themes of the French presidency of the European Union, and that's why your conference is so important to us, because it will contribute to defining priorities of the European space industry for decades to come. Your conference is occurring just after the Space Summit, which happened in Toulouse last February 16th. European space ministers bring together in a formal European Council and also a ministerial of the European Space Agency. This was an essential summit for me for various reasons. First of all, because the worldwide space race is on the table again, and it allows Europe to have some exceptional things, Galileo, Copernicus, and the satellites that we manufacture. The summit also allowed us to define together the 3 pillars of our strategy so as to guarantee European space sovereignty, and this, I think, must be at the heart of your discussions today. The first pillar is massive investment in innovation in the most strategic areas, particularly for our future space champions. The second pillar is mastery of critical new technologies and rules for use of space. We have made big advances in the European connectivity product and on the definition of space traffic management, Europe-wide and internationally. A third pillar of our strategy is the definition of a scientific ambition which is shared for the European space sector in the 21st century. We have reached consensus on how to improve Copernicus and the need to give Europe a clear strategy concerning space exploration. The Toulouse summit was, hence, for Europe, a great success. And it's by way of continuing this summit that your conference on digital affairs and space is happening at an important point of reflection, exchange, and work between the chairs of parliamentary committees in our 27 member countries and the European Parliament. I am aware of the quality of your work, the determination that each and every one of us has to arrive at a consensus, and I think, therefore, we will pay particular attention to the conclusions of your conference. Thank you all very much, and I wish you an excellent conference on space. Thank you very much, dear Bruno. Madam Chair, you have the floor to introduce the next speakers. Thank you very much. Dear colleague, dear Chair, we will now come back to our discussion with our many and prestigious panelists. And to make our exchanges a bit more dynamic, I'd suggest that we hear from our speakers in 2 phases, with some questions from members of Parliament between those 2 stages, if that is agreeable to you all. So we can begin with Mr. Timo Bertinen, who is Director General of the DG Defis at the European Commission, who will be speaking on behalf of Commissioner Breton, as you said, who is unfortunately unable to be with us. He will be able to tell us about the very many projects presently underway concerning space, in particular the proposal to have a new connectivity constellation, as well as the development of awareness as to Europe's need to make itself felt as a power, including a military power, in this area which has become decisive, space. Mr. Pezanen, if You're here and ready? Is the video?
Hello, can you see me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Hello, good afternoon. Honorable chairpersons of the parliamentary committees, honorable members of the parliament, ladies and gentlemen. Indeed, Commissioner Breton personally asked me to replace him in this important event because he's on his way to the Baltic countries, to the front line, to the 3 countries who are really exposed to the Russian border. Europe is at a turning point. Russia has broken peace on the European continent, violated international law, and attacked the territorial sovereignty of an independent Ukraine. Yesterday, President Zelensky addressed the European Parliament and called for further help and solidarity. We together, the European Union, its member states, and the whole international community, United Nations, NATO, USA, and the others, are taking the responsibility. And for good reasons. What is at stake is the future of Ukraine and the future of Europe. And beyond this, also what we cherish most, our freedom, our destiny, and our security. We need to stand up because Europe is in danger. Taboos are falling apart. Europe does not shy away from deploying its assets to support Ukraine, including for the first time ever in buying and transferring military equipment to Ukraine. Let me now turn to the subject of today. Europe is a space power. Galileo and Copernicus are each in their own domain the best performing programs in the world. We have unique industrial and intellectual know-how, a comprehensive industrial fabric made up of and startups and highly competent national agencies able to adapt to the challenges of the future, just as sickness. But space is undergoing major transformations. First, there is the return of power competition in space, as already mentioned by previous speakers. We need to reposition our programs and differentiate ourselves by more excellence and security. As a result, we quickly launched the modernization of Galileo and accelerated the preparation of the second generation Galileo. We will have more efficient and more robust satellites. We also launched 2 weeks ago in Toulouse by Commissioner Breton a debate on the modernization of Copernicus to make it more digital and more resilient. Finally, the Commission has proposed the establishment of a third space constellation to secure connectivity. This initiative will strengthen the EU's resilience from 3 angles. First, from economic, by ensuring redundancy with terrestrial infrastructure, which will allow Europe to remain connected no matter what arrives on terrestrial networks. Strategically, by setting up an ultra-secure infrastructure through quantum encryption. And geopolitically, offering Africa a connectivity alternative necessary to the projects of our strategic competitors, notably Chinese. This constellation will also cover Arctic regions. Then there is the challenge of new space, or next space, whatever you want to call it, which characterizes this vibrant ecosystem of new entrepreneurs who take their chance in space. This is a great adventure. In France, at least one startup every week is created in the space sector. One startup every week in space sector. It is also a unique opportunity. These entrepreneurs bring us new ideas, disruptive technologies, more efficient industrial processes. We must give them a chance, include them alongside traditional industrial players to strengthen our European industry. It is not about opposing old and new industry, but about building bridges, creating opportunities, and cooperation. So how to support the small entrepreneurs? First, by giving them the opportunity to grow in Europe. Venture capital is too risk adverse, unlike in the US. We cannot afford a situation where a startup cannot find private investors to scale up and produce on a larger scale. Many turn to a non-European investors. Commissioner Breton has set up a Cassini facility to boost private venture capital investments and to put an end to this leak of our talent. With this fund, we will unlock an investment capacity of more than 1 billion euro by 2027. It will attract venture capital funds to the space sector. But we must also use the leverage of the public contract. By accessing public contracts, for example, in the form of purchasing services or data, these startups benefit from a formidable accelerator of growth. This is why we want to make place for these startups in our major programs, including Copernicus and the new Secure Connectivity Program. And finally, there is the issue of defense. Silos between space and defense are over. For a simple and obvious reason, space is a strategic and fundamental sector for our security. This is obvious in the current war between Ukraine and Russia. You have all noticed that. With EU defense ministers in Brest in January, we discussed the need to act quickly. Together with the High Representative, we will draft a space strategy for security and defense to strengthen our resilience in and from space. And the Commissioner has decided to accelerate the preparation of the space defense strategy. Let me outline 4 lines of action. First of all, we need to mainstream the defense dimension in our civilian infrastructure. The idea would be to export the Galileo PRS model to all our space infrastructures, starting with Copernicus. Defense has clear requirements in Earth observation. We will integrate them into Copernicus 2.0. Secondly, we need to take advantage of the development of new systems to turn them into dual infrastructure by nature. This is what we plan to do with the Secure Connectivity Initiative. We will develop this initiative by integrating military requirements from the outset. The same applies to space traffic management. The European Union already has a surveillance and alert capacity which provides a service to our armies. However, we need to go further, strengthening our existing capabilities, establishing a European approach to space traffic management, and reducing our dependencies on US data. On these 2 strands, secure connectivity and space traffic management, the Commission presented an ambitious package just 2 weeks ago, just on the eve of the Toulouse Ministerial Conference. We have the support of the French presidency of the Council, as just underlined by Minister Le Maire. And in the European Union, we have very positive response by all the member states. We had initial exchanges in Toulouse, and the work continues in the Council. We are actively engaging with all the member states, with the industry, and in particular with the European Parliament. And we want to move forward quickly. Traditionally, space programs have taken a bit too long time to be built up. This time it will be different. We will move faster. Thirdly, we need to strengthen our autonomous access to space, which is essential for our sovereignty and independence. The Commission is therefore committed to strengthen our strategic launchers and to develop European micro-launch solutions in order to ensure flexibility, responsiveness, and competitiveness of civilian, commercial, and military needs at the same time. We work very closely with Ariane and with WECA. Fourth, we need to reduce our technological dependencies, for example, in quantum, artificial intelligence, or semiconductors. And we need to strengthen our space value chains. Honorable parliamentarians, ladies and gentlemen, this is our roadmap for meeting the challenges of international competition, new space, and defense. To achieve this ambition, we will need to be united, more than ever. This is why we have relaunched the cooperation between the Commission and the European Space Agency, led by Joseph Aspire. We need to continue our efforts to prepare our space programs, reduce our technological dependencies, and respond to the new next space challenge. Many thanks for your attention.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pesonen. Thank you very much indeed. You did mention that owing to previous engagements, you need to leave by 1,500 hours. So thank you very much. We will be moving on to Mr. Xavier Pasco, who heads up the Foundation for Strategic Research, FRS, think tank. He has irreplaceable expertise, and he will give us a general picture of the challenges ahead. Over to you for 5 minutes, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, chairpersons, elected officials, it's a pleasure to speak before you today on the topic of new space and defense and security challenges. Now, when you've been monitoring the space sector for a number of years, like I have, you observe a flurry of activity, since Sputnik, and it is an unprecedented level of activity. There are three main areas that are undergoing deep change. Space exploration with manned space flights, all of the space between our planet and the moon. Also the logistical space around Earth. Never have as many space objects been launched more last March than in all of the year 2016, for example. And that is unprecedented. And the militarization of space as well. There are new ways of occupying space. Not only are we occupying space, we are now inhabiting space. There's a network around the Earth with unprecedented networks. We are placing mass-produced objects. Launchers are going to be able to be reused, and that is going to enable us to inhabit space and project ourselves in space and as living in space as never before. So new uses made of space, but that means that there also need to be new regulations on how we use space and to what ends. There are industrial and strategic challenges as well. There's also a whole realm of new international law that is being built up, either via technical regulations, via the ISO standards bodies, or via the United States. This is generating heated debate. Governments see that it is crucial for them to negotiate standards that where they will come out the winners, of course. So new countries also, new operators with new interests outside of sheer space itself, i.e. information gathering and information dissemination. That is a whole sector that started being set up in the 90s, namely in the military sector in the USA. So we are now have this intersection between the space industry and the information industry. And we see the effects in new space. So what do we mean by new space? New technology, new modes of industrialization, new means of marketing with approaches that come from other industries. A lot of the big space operators today are non-legacy space operators, the GAFA companies, the information players. They see space as one of the bricks in their overarching strategy. And now we're also talking about infrastructure in space. In the past, spatial objects, space technology assets were handcrafted. Now they are mass-produced to set up a whole network that will allow for information dissemination. So it's a multi-stakeholder space. Dual use, of course, you mentioned that, but all of that infrastructure out there is meant for civilian uses, industrial uses, as well as military and strategic uses. And that creates a lot of noise. So we're in this ironic situation where we have more and more information, but it's becoming more and more difficult to read. That whole area, that whole sector is becoming too noisy, very difficult to read. And that raises the challenge of space traffic. That's a very important chunk of work for standardization bodies. What we also see is this new way of projecting ourselves industrially, culturally, even anthropologically. military spaces, in the space of the occupation of space, and in habitation of space. So 3 main pillars. With an effective space industry, we need to be independent in terms of launcher construction. We need that industry to be profitable. And so we also have another industry that adds value to the use of space through the GAFAs. I'm talking about information. And a third pillar, new players that provide momentum to the big machinery that set it in motion. We see these 3 pillars being consolidated in the United States, being set up in China, and we must rise to that same challenge. Thank you.
Merci, merci, Monsieur.
Thank you very much for that very concise and clear presentation. Now, our European and French space industries will define our new presence in space, our ability to exist, to defend ourselves. It's a real arms race that we are seeing in space. Without further ado, I would like to hand the floor over to Mr. Pascal Legaye, who's Security Advisor to the European Space Agency. Hello. I hope that you can see me and hear me. The interpreters would like to note the poor quality of sound. We will do our best. Hello, and hello to all participants. I represent Mr. Josef Raschbauer, Director General of ESA, who unfortunately is not available. He sends his apologies through me and hopes you will have a very fruitful debate. Let me, in just a few minutes, chart out the European Space Agency's main strategic priorities. They do factor in new space as well as the new space challenges for Europe in the context of an aggressive development in the space sector. This requires a consistency and unity amongst European actors. So let me say a few words about the European Space Agency. Just as a reminder, we are a 22-member state intergovernmental body. 3 of them do not belong to the European Union: Switzerland, Norway, the UK. ESA also has agreements with other European states and with Canada. The priorities of ESA are defined by its member states, so it's really a member state-run organization. We have a number of principles in our convention, Article 2 in particular, which states that the agency has a peaceful mission. That's for ESA. Now, when he came to the job in March 2020, when the new Director General proposed 5 priorities for his term, this is known as Agenda 2025. It's a 4-year term for the Director General. However, the vision goes beyond 2035, and it charts out a common vision and mission for the European space industry. The aim is to have a unified front. So the strategy relies on strengthening the ties between ESA and the European Union, developing digital and green space technologies, developing space for security reasons, and also making ESA more relevant by reforming it from within. We are seeing a globalization of space, and against this backdrop, the EU and ESA must show a unified front, must act consistently. We also want to develop the commercial use of space, but according to virtuous principles, so environmentally sound and sustainable. We also have the duty to protect our space infrastructure. It is coming under an increasing number of attacks, including cyber attacks, but we also want to make optimum use of space infrastructure in order when dealing with land-based issues such as conflicts, for example. We also want to use ESA's unique position in Europe to develop ambitious space programs in cooperation with the other global space organizations. Lastly, the organization needs to optimize its internal processes and needs to be able to attract the best talent that's out there. In order to consolidate this approach, the Director General of ESA invited a group of 9 high-level experts to form the high-level advisory group, former ministers of research, officials from European organizations, the goal being to reflect upon the future of space in Europe. The report was drafted, now has been made public online, and it underscores that it's important to accelerate the development and rational use of space assets to serve European goals. There are 3 accelerators and 3 inspirators. The first is Space for a Green Future. That is the overarching priority. The aim is to gain a better understanding of our planet, of how it works, and to offer solutions for sustainable development and a reduction of greenhouse gases to 0 by 2050. The green future was set as the main priority. For the other 2, there's no order of hierarchy. First of all, rapid crisis response mechanism for countries in a situation of crisis. First, in terms of natural disasters that are increasing in frequency and number. For example, the bad storms of floods, fires that have affected Europe. So tensions and conflicts that result from climate change, but also from conflicts. So those require real-time responses. And we are seeing that today. The last accelerator is the protection of space assets against debris, risk of collision with debris, against space weather phenomena that may affect both land-based and space-based space infrastructure, because we depend on that space infrastructure on a day-to-day basis. Lastly, the 2 inspirators that have been offered by these 2 outside experts. Their aim is to consolidate European space research. First of all, human space exploration. This aims at Europe taking an active role in exploring outer space and Mars, namely, and developing potentially commercial opportunities. And IC Moon space sample return. So bringing back an IC sample from the Moon or from Mars or Saturn as part of what we call Voyage 2050. These expert proposals were confirmed by member states of ESA at the last meeting in Portugal at the Matos Manifesto. It underscores support for competition as sources of inspiration, and the Director General is therefore given mandate to focus energy on these inspirators and to ensure that the various powers of the member states and the European Union and their level of authority is respected. Lastly, we need to seize the opportunity generated by the exploration of space and the use of space in an inclusive and sustainable way while strengthening the autonomy and independence of Europe. We want to defend Europe from heightened competition for space after the pandemic. We need new momentum, new energy, and space is well poised to provide Europe with that opportunity and with those that new space. So new space, I would say, space is not new, you know. However, instead of new space, why don't we term it next to space, as proposed by an Airbus official at the very recent space convention in Brussels? Thank you. Thank you very much. Over to Philippe Baptiste, who chairs the board of directors of the French National Space Research Council, CNES. CNES performs excellent work, has always made itself available to talk to us here as MPs. Over to you, Director General. President, CEO. Thank you very much for those kind words regarding CNES and for the extremely interesting topic for your afternoon meeting. There is one theme I would like to start off with. That is to highlight the very strong bond between Europe and space. The bulk of space programs are dual in nature, civilian and military. That's the bond I would like to highlight. Space cannot remain undefended, and military endeavors need space, so there can no longer be defense without space, and space cannot exist without defense. I'd also like to mention that this new space effort is gaining great momentum, and it's really just applying progress in terms of digitalization and miniaturization to space, to the space market. The space market, the space industry has seen over the past few years and the emergence of a number of very competitive operators offering highly innovative solutions, sometimes based on entirely new technology, not systematically, but quite often. So, given the very strategic, economic, industrial nature of this challenge, the question that is posed today is, what is the best way to really harness all of these opportunities? And the real response should come from a space policy that would be articulated around three main areas. Number one, contribute to our strategic independence and autonomy. Secondly, seek economic efficiency, and finally seek to defend our interest via the space economy. So strategic autonomy was the first area. The first two vital elements of this for Europe is, number one, to be able to have a launch base. The Kourou spaceport, the European Space Center is located in Kourou. Then we also need to have a whole range of launchers from light to heavy so that we can deal with all of the launches that need to be made. Now, this may come through in the questions, but you know that Soyuz is now pulling out of Kourou, so there are this brings questions. So I mentioned that first requirement. Strategic autonomy can first and foremost be ensured by having a sustainable space industry. You have the same companies that build both civilian and military space systems. So we need a robust space economy and industry. We need to keep it alive, not only for economic reasons, but also for strategic reasons. On this note, I would like to remind you that more than its competitors, the European space industry is really dependent on its commercial operators. This accounts for 40% of all revenues, as compared to less than 10% for its competitors that have a more highly developed captive institutional market. So for the commercial market, by the commercial market, I mean sales to private operators and exports outside Europe. So more than our competitors. Our European industry must adapt to the market, must remain competitive, because it certainly would be damaging if we lost this economic autonomy. That would mean that we would lose our ability to produce strategic arms or space systems in Europe, and that's unacceptable.
Les efforts de notre
We have to think in terms of how to accompany these measures. It's a key aspect, our second pillar. Obviously, I can't go into everything, but I can mention here the support measures taken recently to encourage the space sector in the context of the economic recovery plan in France. Further initiatives have already been taken by CNES and have borne fruit, such as the development of the low-cost reusable engine Prometheus, together with Ariane Group, which made it possible to have high-performance nano-satellites with Imeria. These orbital platforms are very soon going to provide a response that will be in line with the challenges facing us. And then, in the light of the strategic context that's been described by Xavier Pascoe, the country has to have a defense strategy in space. This brings in a major change as regards space questions and our approach to them, and clearly states that there's a desire to defend our interests in space, including actively. The CNES is fully involved, together with the Ministry of the Armed Forces, in this strategy, and in this way we're making a significant contribution to the boosting of competence in the armies and working on the development of a future military space capability. It will continue to provide support to inter-army operations, and then there's something new to make it possible for there to be action in space involving the command structure as well. So that's a broad outline of how CNES sees things as regards to the matters we're discussing this afternoon. Thank you. Thank you very much for these elements. I think that at this point we should perhaps turn to questions from our participants before we come back to further inputs from the panel. So I'll call out the first three. They each have 4 minutes to speak. The first, Domagoj Adokovic from the Croatian Parliament. Then Francesco Bonomo from the Chamber of Deputies in Italy, followed by José Magalhães from the Republic Assembly in Portugal. So, could I ask Mr. Hajdukovic to take the floor first, please? And I apologize if I have incorrectly pronounced your name.
Plus une mauvaise connexion.
Thank you, Madame Dumas. And the Croatian Parliament, when we are at the moment debating the security situation in Ukraine. Space is unharnessed resource in many respects, but I would like to underline, dear colleagues, the security aspect of space. Technology has always been an edge in deterring aggression, in deterring what is happening now, unfortunately, to Ukraine. So I would be very much interested to hear more about the defense capabilities and the defense technology that is developed at the moment. Why, if we had more resources and more of a technological edge, maybe these very unseemly things that are happening in Ukraine would not happen? In this respect, I would be pleased to hear from the panelists more about this issue. You have called on the European unity in this regard. I think that we have reached a very high level of consensus when it comes to the security issues, which are now definitely on the agenda of the Union in general, national parliaments, European Parliament, and governments. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I look forward to your answers.
Merci.
Thank you. Francesca Bonomo.
Madame Francesca Bonomo.
Ms. Francesca Bonomo from the Italian Chamber of Deputies. Are you online with us? Well, while we're waiting for her to connect, I suggest we move to José Magalhães from the Portuguese Assembly of the Republic.
Greetings from Portugal. This is a good and essential debate, and we appreciate the contributions that have been brought to us. But let me stress that the circumstances changed when this meeting was convened. We didn't have an invasion of Ukraine, and we could discuss space issues as in the usual terms with business as usual. Nowadays, we face new challenges. On the one hand, space is attractive, and the United States have dominated the main tools, and they have a new space strategy which should be carefully considered by Europeans. Secondly, a second industrial revolution is happening in the other side of the Atlantic, but not here in European territory. We are just giving the first steps, and during the Portuguese presidency, some debates took place in Lisbon, which were encouraging, and we have good news recently from the Commission. The Commission has announced what the Commission called a new space strategy, which is still in development. But it suffers from a clear lack of investment, and it is still too small, with projects often being just implemented at national level and with national rivalries. Clearly, the mention made to the initiatives announced by President Macron are relevant, but they are relevant to France, not exactly relevant to the Portuguese Republic, although we may learn from the French experience. Secondly, the budgetary support for the European space policy remains clearly fragmented. In 2021, during the Portuguese presidency of the Council of the European Union, we had an unprecedented budget approved of 14.88 billion for 2021-2027, and this is supposed to finance the EU space program, to strengthen the European Union space programs and improve their governance. The space package presented by the Commission in February will certainly have to be updated and reconsidered as the new situation offers new challenges, some of them quite dangerous, meaning that the disorder in space, the space debris, the possibility of having missiles destroy assets, and the vulnerabilities of the European Union in what comes to connectivity supplied through constellation of satellites are quite visible and they cannot be denied. So we badly need to correct those situations. And it's not by chance that the new strategic compacts for the EU includes a chapter on the new space strategy. The doubt I have to express, allow me this, is if that text is appropriate in this precise moment in which we have to face the priority of offering our neighbors and allies in Ukraine tools to support their effort to fight against an invasion which is being done using all kinds of tools, including cyber tools of all kinds and space tools, which we don't even know in precise terms, and we should. Meaning, and this is my final remark, meaning that we need intelligence, specific intelligence on what's happening at the space level. It's not just reducing the tech dependence we have from the United States, but cooperating with the United States to have more and better intelligence on what is being done at the space level. The Portuguese Republic has been contributing within limited budgetary terms to those efforts, and never forget that the European Space Agency is for specific purposes, not for military purposes. So we stand undefended in what comes to military terms, and we are the sitting duck from that point of view. And Europe cannot be the sitting duck when we talk about space and space attacks and space weapons. The space is being weaponized and is being weaponized by entities that do not respect the international law. And this is extremely dangerous. That's the new landscape we are facing, and we should consider seriously. This is a very abnormal and dangerous situation. So this is not the usual debate. Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman.
Merci.
Thank you very much. We've managed to establish the link with Francesca Bonomo. I believe she should be with us now from the Chamber of Deputies of Italy. Well, it would seem that, in fact, there are still connection problems. Thank you, anyhow, for the interventions. And the panelists will, of course, answer to them as they will when they come to the others as well. Industrial players now in this struggle for existence, survival, and innovation in space. Obviously, we cannot talk about European competitiveness without the vital and precious advantage that we have, which was our ability to have some of the best launchers in the world. If we take a look at the challenges of the future, we have Stéphane Israël, the CEO of Arianespace. He'll be telling us about reusable technologies for launchers, human spaceflight, and also the challenges of the defense and protection of our launchers and spacecraft. And I'm sure that what he has to say will be most useful. So, Mr. Israël, you have the floor. I hope you can hear me. First of all, I'd like to thank the National Assembly for having invited me to talk to you about our activities, which are, of course, very closely linked to the public domain and to your assemblies. And we need to have this constant dialogue and to have full understanding and support. I'll try to make a number of comments in the light of the dramatic situation that we're in. Philippe Baptiste, and I'd like to express my wishes to him. You can't have space without defense. You can't have defense without space. Ariane Group is behind Ariane and also the ballistic missiles that are at sea in order to guarantee our security and safety. So there's a clear link. Secondly, you can't have space without geopolitics. And this is highly topical as well. The Ariane 6 and Vega C programs were devised in 2014 at the time of the invasion of the Crimea. And one tends to forget, and I didn't want to mention this because we have a partnership with Soyuz, but we tend to overlook the fact that one of the drivers behind the decision was to make sure that as quickly as possible, Space Europe could have independent access to space. And we wouldn't have decided in favor of these two launchers if that had not been at the back of our minds. The cooperation around Soyuz came about after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The French established links with the Russians. It was a decision taken at the highest possible level. It's a very original partnership that also saw the development and construction of a launch pad in French Guiana. We've seen things pertaining to that in recent days. And it's a partnership that's worked extremely well with the Russian industrialists and space agency very committed. And you can't have such a partnership without the right geopolitical context. And that came with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the desire to establish a bridgehead with Russia. And that has constantly been recalled right through to the moment of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we were still working before the invasion on the follow-up to the cooperation. Obviously, if there's a geopolitical change, then unfortunately such a cooperation is going to be hard hit. And you know that for several days now, the bridges have been pulled up and Russia has withdrawn from the CSG. And today we heard that as regards a OneWeb launch from Baikonur, there was pressure being brought to bear by the Russians as regards that launch. So unfortunately, there's no longer space in such a geopolitical situation. We'll see what will happen as things evolve, and I would be delighted if we could return to cooperation because it's been extremely fruitful. But it has been suspended for the time being. And we hope that very soon we will be able to have new launches thanks to the agreement that was reached in 2014. European and French strategy, I think, is very clear. There's a desire to support the launchers of the future, Ariane 6 and Vega C. There's a very important decision taken by the European Space Agency, pushed by the French and the Germans, and then the French and the Italians. In other words, to allow the two launchers to face international competition with more support, because you can't have a launch vehicle without public support. That decision was taken in August 2021 by ESA. And that'll be of assistance to us, not only to deploy European satellites, but also to be competitive on the market. The good news is that these launchers, particularly Ariane 6, are very well suited to the new trends on the market, and particularly for large constellations. And then there's a second pillar, which is the desire to accelerate innovation. Today, there's an awful lot that's happening around micro launchers, which could involve new players, and we could have one-off projects, because if you've got a micro launcher, then it's a micro ambition as compared to a larger launcher. But we could pursue such projects. There are some in Germany, there are some in France. There's Maya Space that has been entrusted to Ariane Group, and it's the expression of a desire on the part of the Presidency and the Ministry of Finance. And such projects should make it possible for us to accelerate further preparatory steps. Let me say that it's the market strategy that's at the forefront. If we take these two projects and we put them in the hands of more traditional players, then we'll end up in a dead end, because we fundamentally need Ariane 6 and Vega C. and we need the expertise of the traditional players. And Maya Space was entrusted to Ariane Group, who's a traditional player, even though there's a spin-off that's been established to do this. The second message that I'd like to push through is that these projects will never deploy strategic satellites over Europe, perhaps intermittently. Spacecraft has already been said that it'll be quick responsive space. Okay, fine. But basically, military satellites are large satellites that need large launchers. So if you don't mind, I'd like to put things into perspective. Autonomous access to space for Europe requires large launch vehicles, and we have to be convinced of that, and we mustn't mix things up. And when we're talking about large constellations, American constellations, European constellations, if they're ambitious, then they're going to need large launchers as well. And we're not going to be able to use micro-launchers for these, even though such micro-launchers can be there as a support, if you like. I really wanted to make that because I think space sometimes leads to confusion in people's minds, and I think we need to clarify this. So we have to know what it is we expect of such projects. And in reality, and this is the point of Maya Space, they're going to help us to accelerate certain techniques and technologies, and in due course we'll be able to embark upon the construction of a new launcher family. We need one at European level. We need this particularly today. It has to be reusable, because if the market explodes, we will need reusable launchers, because they will accelerate the availability of our launchers, and they have to be as ecological as possible, as green as possible, because that is there's no way around that. So what we want to do is to guarantee the success of Ariane 6 and Vega C, which is of strategic import to Europe, with others get involved in innovative projects, and with a view to 2030, have a real European convergence around a family of innovative and eco-responsible launchers. So I just wanted to finish on that point. Eco-responsibility, clean space, responsible space. It's a concern that is going to evolve. And all of the players involved, including industry, have to commit to that responsibility. Thank you for having given me the floor.
Merci, Président. Je vais...
Thank you, Chairman. I shall give the floor to my colleague for the presentation that follows. Thank you, dear Chair. Thank you, C. Stéphane Israël. We've heard from a lot of men this afternoon. And since we have the honor and the pleasure also to have a woman entrepreneur who is going to be taking the floor, I asked for the chair the possibility to present her. I'm very happy to co-chair the session with a woman, under the authority of another woman, but we always have the impression that space seems a bit limited to women. And now we have Barbara Huzik, who's a woman who will be taking the floor, and she is above all a businesswoman, a visionary, an innovator who works in space but also has her feet on the earth and in several different countries thereof. So I'm very happy to present to you the CDG of Interstellar Lab, Barbara Huzik, and she will be showing you how innovation can be put at the very heart of innovation in space. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair OC. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored and pleased to be here to share with you my experience as a woman, a businesswoman in new space. As you've indicated, I am the founder and chair of the Interstellar Company. We're a startup, a Franco-American startup. We have that specific hybrid model, a rather international geographic model, and we also have different structures where we will have a look at the different climatic conditions within these inflatable structures. Now, what does this mean? It means that we're developing greenhouses with controlled environment. We'll use traditional technology to develop solutions for more sustainable agriculture on Earth. And in space, we work with different space agencies, including NASA and ICNAS, to see how we can adapt our conditions to the basic orbit of the Moon and soon of Mars, so that these plants can grow in the space and provide food for astronauts that will be extraterrestrial food. We're about 20 people today. The company has doubled in size. We have 6 nationalities represented: French, Italian, Dutch, Lebanese, Brazilian, Tunisian, and of course American. We have people who used to work for SpaceX, NASA, CNES, Palestinian, Airbus, Disney, and Agricool. So as you see, we're fairly representative of this new generation of entrepreneurs with international ambitions and a project which is trying to zero in on bringing together different countries. We're basically presented in Ivry. It's like Asterix is a little Gaulish village on the fringes of the Paris area, and we're basically working on our first greenhouse. I've come from Munich yesterday, where we are making our membranes, and then the shells are being produced with manufacturers in Brittany. We're a team of 20 people. We're coming out of a European project which is called Space Founders, and which was developed by ESA, CNES, and the German Space Agency. And we are coming now into a French-American program called Stardust, which is supported by NASA and by CNES. We will be announcing next Monday raising $5 million. We're still a young startup that is just starting up. And with our investors around this time, we'll have institutional investors, English, American, German, and some French ones. Up until now, we've been financed by business angels in our true startup phase, and now we're starting to get institutional financing as well. But we'll need more, and that's one of the points that I will come to later. We've also gotten NASA financing for one of our crop systems, and thanks to CNES's support, we'll also have a few months of extra financing from the Public Investment Bank. So, which is a French structure. So there are 3 things I'd like to share with you, which come from my experience as a woman entrepreneur in new space. The first is the issue of financing new space. The second is the role of Europe in space and the new for business models. And the third is to construct a space model which is beneficial to the Earth and the transposition of the European model of space. Financing of new space. I entirely agree with everything that was said. There is a need today for Europe to be able to have reusable launchers, because we not need only micro launchers, but also large ones, because we'll need infrastructures that are going to allow us to develop all of these systems that we will need to have cislunar economy properly installed. We're also going to have, for new space, the need for entrepreneurs and for startups, and I think this is of fundamental importance. We need to integrate today that if we're talking about new space, it means that at the very outset, what got this kick-started was an American entrepreneur called Elon Musk, who got started with SpaceX, and that started our economy running again, basically. And at the basis of this new space here in Europe, we're also going to have startup funds for investment in these funds. In the 3 first years of our company's life, I really had to go looking for funding from business angels, and that's not a sustainable model for European space companies to have to turn to business angels to get their companies funded. There need to be startup funds earmarked for space things that will be of substantial scale to let tomorrow's leaders emerge. That's how big startups are born. And institutional investors need to do this, and that doesn't happen nearly often enough today. The second thing is the role of Europe and the need for this new business model. Europe's role, we have incontestable expertise in manufacturing spaceships, given the players that are already well established here. But I think we need to get away from a pure manufacturer role to propose business models that have to do with services. When we look at players like SpaceX or even Axia, who are developing orbital stations today, we are not positioned really as manufacturers, but only as suppliers of technology. What they are suggesting is services to open the access to space and to develop a cislunar and extraterrestrial economy. So it is now up to us to position ourselves and to offer things to industry, to science, to the general public, to develop a whole economy around access to space, for agricultural production in space, for development of science and research, and especially for tourism, which is something we don't talk a lot about in Europe, and which is in everyone's remarks in the United States when we talk about this. So we have to have different transport systems, but as I've said, we also need to have services that are going to create added value. And I think that Europe can position itself like Apple in space and not rather like a simple producer of technology. My last point, positioning of Europe and the language that we use, which is going to be of fundamental importance for as a base for the European model. Today we have a context which is way too similar to the Cold War and to blocs conflicting. Today we can make ourselves the bearers of an ideal which is about hope, which will be beneficial to the whole world, especially in the fight against climate change. We can propose a third way forward among these two blocs that are having a Star Wars, if it's in scenario of conflict. When humanity starts to build a multiplanetary civilization, Europe needs to be able to contribute to that development and to construct this structure along with everyone else. Thank you. That was just a wonderful conclusion. Thank you very much. We will continue. We have the luck to have Europe with a variety of powerful industries that are present in satellite construction in this new Constellation context. And so we have Thales, which is obviously a major player, and I'm very attentive to these questions of satellite security, given the rise in threats we see around us. Mr. Philippe Carrière, who is Vice President for Executive Strategy, Research and Technology of the Thales Group, will be able to share his experience with us and perhaps launch a plea for a greater concentration of forces in this worldwide battle for supremacy in new space. Mr. Vice President, Mr. Vice Chairman, are you online? Are you connected? Can you connect, sir? You would need to push on the button. I'm not sure what it's called. Speak, perhaps, or microphone. Very well. Then let us pass on to the following speaker, Mr. Philippe Pham, and then we'll come back to Mr. Carrier afterward, if that's possible. Mr. Philippe is the first Vice President of the Observatory of the Earth and Sciences at Airbus Defense and Space, and he will fill out already the very striking picture that's been sketched out by previous speakers. Are you online, sir? Can you hear me? That's excellent. You have the floor, sir. Madam Chair, Mr. Chair, members of Parliament, dear colleagues. Thanks, first of all, for giving me this opportunity to share with you a few words. As we've already heard in previous exchanges, I would like, first of all, to express our enthusiasm about the Space Summit, which happened in Toulouse on the 16th, and then the 2035 conference held by ESA, the EU, EUMETSAT, and various member countries. A lot of ambition, a lot of energy, and we are also entirely turned toward the preparation of the ministerial conference for the end of 2022, so as to prepare the next budgetary phases of ESA. Europe has shown that it has the dimension and the capacity necessary to successfully develop world-class programs. Copernicus and Galileo were cited many times. We haven't talked about the EUMETSAT meteorological satellites, the big scientific exploration Sun to Jupiter missiles, which have allowed us better to know our universe, and then Gaia or comet missions like Rosetta. We will go on with the next generation. We're preparing a second Galileo generation to be launched in 2024-25. Reference was also made to the next generation of Copernicus, and the next launches will happen in 26-27, and as well the next Sentinels. And soon there will be safe connectivity, space surveillance in orbit, but also the Mars return mission, which will bring us back samples in 2031. So these are very ambitious missions, and Airbus has always supported this dynamic. And as a European champion in space and in defense has been a world leader in a variety of areas. We have always played a major role in these programs, and we are trying as best we can to continue to be present, to push our limits ever further outwards, and to work with the technology used in space, sensors, platforms, satellites, to have mastery of large complex systems, and to see that these are missions which are unique in their kind. There are innovations at every step of the way. The only industrial actors in the space sector that is present in every part of the value chain is us. That allows us also to be technologically up to date and to be connected to the market. We have mentioned services quite a lot, value-added solutions for clients, and it's very important to link these two things together, to be a major player with good knowledge of the market on the three pillars, which are civil, institutional, defense, and commercial exploration, to allow us to optimize investment, both public and private, and to guarantee good synergies and competitiveness on a market which is always a cyclical one. The President of the CNES reminded us of the share of commercial and the share of institutional affairs in the overall total, and it's very important for our skills, for our teams to be engaged in all three of these three major areas, so as to be able to remain long-lasting, up-to-date in the medium term and the long term for decades to come, both in terms of capacity of infrastructure and of services, so as to guarantee sustainability and resilience, which are very important criteria. A few concrete examples. We talk about new space, legacy space. Pascal Lagarde mentioned next space. And in fact, the message I'm trying to bring across today is to be in the best of all possible worlds, to take account of our past, our history, of the lessons we have learned. And as 21st century space players, we would also wish to take account of the best practices and use of new space in design, industrialization, financing, but also to base ourselves on reliability, expertise, and the heritage of great space missions. And Airbus is invested in space. We've been talking about financing. We've invested roughly 1 billion euros over the last 2 or 3 years for the planned new 30-centimeter Constellation, which is almost entirely financed, developed, and operated by Airbus. We're also showing laser communications, and we'll be using Militarization, the Space Center Highway, for real-time communications. We've co-invested in innovating program with CNES and DGA to have a revisit and observation of the Earth with 50-centimeter optics. We're investing on the Bartolomeo platform to propose onboard services on ESS. We're investing in OneSat, the next generation of flexible satellites, defined by software for next-generation telecoms. And we'll also have an arm in risk capital, venture capital, which will be choosing and investing in the most promising startups that Astrocast, OHEAD 60, Aerospace Lab, and so forth can go on. A real player in new space and also within the ecosystem. We also wanted to bring about a revolution in our satellite design. We're on OneWeb, more than 400 satellites in orbit out of 600, with big design novelties, electric propulsion, while still respecting space operation laws. We are very attentive to leaving a clean, low orbit. We are also contributing to the access to space and its expansion. Many examples have been mentioned with launchers, on our side with satellites and reprogramming in orbit, OneSat, with the experimental platform ESS Bartolomeo, digital platforms, in particular One Atlas and 142, which will allow us to process online satellite image reserved with machine learning and analytics. More than 200 startups are on board in the sandbox so as to develop services. And there's also great agility and lots of activity in this field. So the message I'd like to bring across today is that we're working hand in hand with the whole spatial ecosystem, upstream with electronics, satellites, and so forth, and downside with software, services, and what have you, with startups that are on board, SMEs, institutions, all throughout Europe and beyond as well. We're already working very operationally with these startups. For instance, we've just signed a big platform supply contract with Orbital, and we're a subcontractor for them. We're also developing space capacities in many different countries. So we're taking our responsibilities, both for the development of ecosystems and adapting them, and also to go on helping build this building and pooling our experience. We know we have to stay humble, not to get complacent, remain vigilant. There's a lot of competition. We've talked about the Americans and the Chinese. There are other countries as well. We see there are different phases, pandemic, war, a rise in nationalism and different forms of antagonism, risks of weakness in Europe, budgetarily speaking, policies, but also defense. And Europe, however, has the ability to face up to all of this and to change the scale of its ambitions.
Now, space, as was said, is increasingly central. We have to move from new space to next space, include all actors, break down silos, be ambitious, bring about new projects, work as teams, once again, break down silos, open up new opportunities, generate value, growth based on hybrid public-private funding models, complementarity between infrastructure and services, bring small and large players together. We mustn't forget to be customer-focused. Our objective must be services, reaching out to final users and offering them the services and the applications they need, and play on that dual aspect, new space plus legacy space, the alliance between public and private, complementarity between military and defense. We need to have a common front, and we can be proud of what has been accomplished in Europe with these new ambitions and these new contributions. We will, I'm sure that there's a bright future ahead for us in space in Europe. Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Vice President. Now, I'm very happy to see on the screen Mr. Philippe Carrière. He is Executive Vice President for Strategy, Research and Technology for Thales. Thales is also a major player, extremely focused on security of satellites in context of emerging threats. So, Mr. Executive Vice President, you will be giving us your perspective, your experience, and perhaps call for a better concentration of forces in the global battle for the supremacy of new space. Now, your previous the previous speaker, your colleague from Airbus, spoke far more than his allotted time, and I will not subtract that from your speaking time. Nevertheless, I would like to remind you that you have an allotted 4 minutes. Thank you. Thank you very much for that message. And you will hear from my comments that I'm very much aligned with the message conveyed by Philippe from Airbus. There are two main messages here. Number one, but speaking from a position of humility, we can be very proud of the overall space industry in Europe across the entire value chain, from the smallest companies and startups to the main players like ourselves and Airbus. Let me give you a few examples that illustrate that. Number one, concerning the trade surplus, we contribute to an average surplus of $1 billion we contribute to the tune of $1 billion to the balance of payments in the European Union. Also, we showed leadership on a number of markets, such as the Internet of Things with Kines and telecommunications and satellite constellations, as well as geostationary satellites. And to understand the success better, over the past few years, about 50% of all orders on the open market have been won, or contracts have been awarded to to European players. Now, we have contributed, along with Airbus, to inventing new generation reusable geostationary satellites that are software-driven. And amongst these two prime companies, we are amongst the two prime companies that hold the leadership in this area. Looking at other sectors, with European funding, we've been able to develop world-class infrastructure such as Galileo, Copernicus, our various weather satellites, and that can certainly form the basis for our use of space as a catalyst for digital and green space industry, making for better sovereignty in space, and as a catalyst for more unity in Europe. This has been the result of continued public investment over the past 50 years, not just our group, but across the entire industry. So on to my second message. In order to rise up to the second challenge, Europe needs to be agile. So what kind of challenge am I referring to? Quantum communication, orbital services, secure, resilient communications. You referred to that when you mentioned cybersecurity, managing traffic in space, high revisit imagery, and setting up the digital twin for our planet. So we need an agile strategy for Europe's space industry based on a number of pillars. First of all, accelerating innovation cycles. Innovation does make us stronger, has made us stronger, and has allowed us to consolidate our leadership. But the space industry and European institutions need new agile methods in order to stay in the lead. So we need to create an open innovation ecosystem that makes it possible to establish new partnerships, have new business models. The example of Kines is telling. This is a partnership between institutions, small, medium-sized enterprises, startups, and large companies, and has led to total novel IoT solutions. There's another area that Thales Alenia Space is involved in, a partnership with Axiom, a private company that does exploration. And just to quote from my Airbus colleague, there is no opposition between old or legacy space and the new space. There's only one continuum in how we build the space of the future, so the next space. Then, for this new structure, new strategy to be built up, we need to work together as Europeans and set up this new technology, put in new resources. In order to do so, the European space industry must set ambitious objectives, the same as for digital sovereignty or the new Green Deal, of the same order. And therefore, we absolutely must continue the Copernicus and Galileo programs that where Europe really took the leadership. So these programs need to be continued. Looking now at connectivity in space and surveillance or monitoring of traffic, Thierry Breton's initiative in these two areas are quite welcome. They are strategic initiatives. They are underpinned by the EU's new ambition. Lastly, we need to see new main programs in Europe around sustainable space or the development of new orbital services, new showcase programs. So we must leave all naivete aside. We must understand that space is a strategic area, and having mastery of space is very important. As Europe, we need a new ambition for space. We need a heightened we need greater public investment in order to stay in the lead and to keep that mastery. Thank you very much. As our last part of our debate, I would like now to give the floor to a number of parliamentarians who've done some important work in this area. First of all, Christophe Grudler, a member of the European Parliament, who was rapporteur on the recently adopted European Industrial Strategy and Space Programme. He is also vice chairman of the European Parliament's Sky and Space Group. So, dear colleague, I will give you the floor for 5 minutes.
Bien, alors dans l'attente de ça.
So we hope that he'll be able to connect very soon. So why don't we hand over to, well, I see one of the next two MEPs, members of Parliament, and so he's in the room, so certain to be able to speak. So Pierre Cabaret and Jean-Paul Lecoq must be on the line as well, must be online. They have just published a fascinating report on space for our Committee on Foreign Affairs. So I don't know how you've agreed to organize this presentation. Pierre, over to you. And in a live microphone would be much better. If the chairperson could hand over the microphone. Thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure to be connected here in person with you here in the room. I do come from Toulouse. That's where I was born. But first, I've been amiss. I did not extend my greetings to you, Madam Chair, moderator, fellow MPs, dear friends. I would like to start off by quoting the President of the Republic. He spoke in Toulouse last January 16th, and he said, having a vision on protection and resilience of our space infrastructure and on the response we can organize with our allies when attacked. That is one of our priorities. Mr. Lecoq and myself were tasked with drawing up a report on space diplomacy. This report is really quite important in the light of recent event. Mr. Putin, who is now hit by European sanctions, and Russia has withdrawn from the Kourou space station, and it's up to the Russians to decide how they are going to get back to the space station. They need to meet those conditions. But this perhaps opens an opportunity to turn towards the private sector a little more. We have insufficient budgets. We are working in an international arena. There are international developments. We need to reinforce that budget. And so new space, which is already an old term, needs to be a priority in our budgets now. That is an essential element. And we must no longer delay allowing the private sector to occupy the place it deserves in this arena. ESA, at the end of 2021, was already mentioning that it wanted to work towards the goals of new space. If we want that new space to take place, we need to invest in research and, of course, in innovation. New space is being showcased and highlighted in Toulouse today via the so-called Asterix exercises. Now, we must admit that perhaps we were not dynamic enough in taking part or in developing light launchers. Let's hope it's not too late. In any case, what we need now is to be more project-oriented and to accept a risk-taking culture. In that way, we'll be able to open up opportunities for small but very powerful startups. They're powerful in terms of their goals, also in terms of their achievements, but also in terms of what they represent today and what they can represent for the future. Now, I'd like to tell you about a program that has been shaken up quite a bit, Ariane 6. It had a political goal. It suffered a number of disruptions. However, today it has assumed a strategic role. The events of the past few days, I think, have given weight to the European Union. There are 24 countries looking in the same direction at new opportunities. Today, we have an opportunity. We have the right to take our rightful place in this space.
Est-ce que Jean-Paul Lecoq?
Jean-Paul Lecoq, are you online? Are you with us? Hello, everyone. I'm speaking from Le Havre. That's thanks to space and connectivity. Pierre Cabaret has given you a taste of our report, which was just published this week, has also sketched out some of the main challenges. Now, we held hearings and interviews with almost all of the panel members that spoke today. They had interesting things to say. I'd like to focus on the competitiveness of the European industry. We need to increase that competitiveness. A lot of people agree that production must return to Europe, but when we speak in the United States, they say that when you create economic clusters, there may be a contradiction in terms. Europe has long bureaucratic times and time frames compared to China, the United States, etc., where you have just one official deciding on investments, etc. Although, of course, there's the democratic process going through the two houses in the United States. But Europe's bureaucratic procedures are quite slow. So acceleration, yes, including administrative. That's something we definitely need. Then there is the popular view and understanding of challenges in space. Everybody is becoming a specialist in terms of our goals in space. We need to bring space closer to people, to citizens, to allow them to understand why so much is at stake, why space is important for European defense, European unity, to make those investments more palatable, more acceptable. There is a French science popularization show. Maybe we should do the same. We must popularize all the complicated things about space, bring them to the public in a digestible form. There are other audiences as well, Africa, that we must bring these arguments to. So space. Space is not all that infinite, at least not the reachable parts of it. It's becoming more and more congested. More and more operators are out there. What can we do to avoid space becoming a tool to control citizens? And that's something very important. All the people we had talks with said, we do not want excess regulations. Let us be creative, etc. French law, for example, is a restriction. because all satellites now must be able to be brought off orbit. And that may become a European law or an international law very soon. And certainly it must be so that the level field can be, so that the playing field can be leveled, so that we can all work in the same conditions. So we need a definition of how we use space, how we use celestial bodies. It's kind of the Wild West right now, where right is might, where might is right, sorry, and we were told that no, it's not possible, to regulate. That was a few months ago. Today, we're at a crossroads. There's a crisis. We're all thinking about the Ukrainian people, but usually, a crisis leads to rethinking everything, starting from a clean slate. So why don't we rethink international law as applied to space? Perhaps we should revisit the main issues relating to space and the use of celestial bodies. We need to ensure that the same rules apply to all via treaties, via regulations, restrictions, so that space becomes a regulated space, so that we may apply sanctions against those that misuse space. The UN, I think, has already set up a body to monitor space issues, and I think that it should perhaps be given more weight, a wider remit. The report is very interesting. It is to be found on this National Assembly's website. Here it is. We have included a number of recommendations that can be applied at national or European level. It's not too Franco-French, but Pierre Cabaret has shared some of the main industrial questions for France. Europe was often presented as a competitive sector. So why not? That's not so bad. However, we must not forget the competition is international, and we must think as Europeans. And why not have a Europe first principle when there are institutional launches? Why not apply a European preference criterion? That's one of our recommendations. There are many. I was trying to give you just a little foretaste of our report. Thank you very much, Madam.
Thank you very much. Clearly, you feel very passionate about all of this work. So congratulations, and I hope we'll have the opportunity to consult this excellent report online. We'll be sending it to everybody we spoke to, so that means they're going to get it anyhow. Thank you, dear colleague. I'll try again to give the floor to Christophe Grudler, who's an MEP. Mr. Grudler, are you with us? You can hear me. Great. Thank you. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, yes, Europe is a major space player. People tend to overlook this because our space activities are spread between national agencies, EU agencies, or ESA. It's all not terribly uniform and not easy to read through, but Europe has excellent space programs. We've heard about that, Galileo, EGNOS, Copernicus. In the future, there'll be connectivity, and this provides services to millions of our citizens. But I want to be quite frank with you today. This should not blind us. The EU is a second-rank space player, well behind China and the US, with 52 and 43 launchers last year. We had 5 from Europe. So European space policy is at a crossroads, and war at the heart of Europe is going to entrench this position. We've got the question of satellites, what's happening there. There are going to be consequences for our space industry in Europe. we have to understand that decisive choices will have to be made in the coming months. For me, the main question is, are we going to have the wherewithal in order to build our European strategic autonomy in space, yes or no? Have we really got sovereignty in launchers? We're talking about European preference for all launch capability. Are we going to beef up our sovereignty when it comes to the design and manufacture of satellites, particularly those of the new generation? Are we going to have European sovereignty in space services, both civilian and also military, and in the area of geointelligence? What I would like to see is that this European space autonomy should be pursued. I think we all have to do this at European, national and local level. We have to have control over our own destiny because we don't yet have a full guarantee of that. If we take defense, for example, as part of the European space policy, to simplify things, let me see, the EU as such is very shy of using space applications for defense. We don't have a European space defense strategy. That's a problem, because if we take a look at the number of services offered by our satellites, we see they've become our eyes and ears that make it possible for us to take action. And without satellites, it's impossible to have ocean communication, military intelligence, etc., etc. We need to be able to protect our European strategy, which is of such major import. So we have to knuckle down to come up with a space defense strategy for Europe, as proposed by President Macron on the 16th of February when he was in Toulouse at the European Space Summit. And at the same time, we have to have the means to have space surveillance with the program SSA, Space Situational Awareness, but there are also defensive means using measurement and equipment for protection, and this can be integrated onto future spacecraft. So the space defense strategy has to go hand in hand with a real European Space Command, which is what Thierry Breton has argued in favor of. Another important thing for me, we don't have our own capability for secure communications, particularly for military and government communications of this nature. Some countries, such as France, have a capability, but that's the exception to the rule. And when two European countries want to communicate in ultra-secure format with each other, it's extremely complex. And that is why the Commission's project for secure connectivity is vital. And we have to find the financial wherewithal to allow this to go ahead. And this will mean that we've got control over our communications in all circumstances and anywhere in the world. It's particularly important with the digitalization of our armies, which need to exchange a lot of data from the theaters of operation. The new European Constellation will have a civilian role as well. It shouldn't be underestimated. We've seen this in the context of the war in Ukraine. We see the civilian impact. Internet access for civilians is a decisive element, and with the Constellation it'll be possible to have information, reassurance and assistance provided to the population. So to finish up on European space sovereignty, let me say that we need all of our space industry, from the smallest SME that works on an infrared high-performance sensor, a startup with an application using European satellite data, right through to groups such as Airbus, OHB, Thales, and so on. And I'd like to congratulate and thank all of them for the excellent work they've carried out. Europe has got certain cards in its hand because these sectors are highly competitive and are familiar with working on the most demanding projects. We're going to have to beef things up, though. Upstream, with the startups and designing innovative spacecraft, or with the small launchers, and then downstream with companies focusing on the exploitation of space data and the creation of services for European citizens. So, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, we have to be ambitious in the context of our European space policy. We need a space policy that is useful for European citizens and throughout the world as well, and a European space policy that is not to be naive, that has to be protected and autonomous. As the rapporteur for Renew Europe for the European Space Programme, and also as I'm in charge of a report on security and defence in space, let me tell you that I am fully committed to all of this, and I will certainly pursue the discussion inter alia with colleagues from the Senate and the French National Assembly. Thank you. Thank you to our colleague from the European Parliament. And I'd like to hand over to colleagues here, Roland Lescure, at this point, who's going to turn back to the questions. We're getting close to the end, I see. We've got 2 requests for the floor from Italy and Romania online. And then I'll ask the panelists, particularly those present in the room, whether they'd like to react to the different interventions, and then the chair, Madame Dumas, will conclude. Francesca Bonomo and Mr. George Christian Tuta. Madame Bonomo. I'd like to thank you for having organized this conference. We're having a high-level debate on very important issues. As has already been said, space is particularly important, and all the more so for our economy. We mustn't overlook the importance of using science and technology in space to meet major social challenges, including the fight against climate change.
Et doit être protagoniste. Il est nécessaire de renforcer le degré d'autonomie européenne dans l'accès et l'utilisation.
The sound quality as received in the interpreters' headsets is inadequate.
Un rôle central dans la coopération internationale. Les nouveaux défis impliquent une augmentation des ressources financières destinées aux investissements européens dans ce secteur, et il est fondamental d'assurer la synergie entre les sources de financement européennes et nationales, ainsi que celui public et privé. Les initiatives présentées récemment par le commissaire Breton vont dans la bonne direction. Toutefois, il est essentiel de ne pas soustraire des ressources aux activités en cours dont il faut assurer l'achèvement. En effet, il est important d'utiliser au mieux et de développer également les outils à disposition en investissant dans la frontière opérationnelle et technologique qui est en train de s'ouvrir. L'Italie entend jouer un rôle de premier plan dans cette partie et vise à accroître les investissements dans le secteur spatial, également par le biais du Plan national de relance et résilience. La stratégie nationale se fixe 3 objectifs. Premièrement, renforcer les capacités et la compétitivité de la filière industrielle qui opère dans le domaine spatial et aérospatial. Deuxièmement, stimuler l'innovation et la recherche scientifique par les investissements ciblés. Troisièmement, créer de nouveaux modèles d'entreprise faisant collaborer les secteurs publics et les secteurs privés. Permettez-moi enfin quelques considérations sur les liens croissants entre l'espace et la défense, nécessitant d'une plus forte attention dans un scénario international plein de tensions géopolitiques et en évolution. L'Europe doit suivre le train de défis au niveau mondial, et dans ce sens, la présentation d'une stratégie spatiale de l'Union européenne pour la sécurité et la défense dans le cadre de la boussole stratégique qui sera prochainement adoptée revêt une importance cruciale, sans oublier la nécessité d'agir également dans ce secteur en coopération avec l'OTAN. Pour conclure, je rappelle le lancement récent du satellite Cosmos SkyMed, qui représente, à mon avis, un modèle de référence pour les synergies entre innovation et recherche civile et militaire. Je vous remercie de votre attention.
Merci, chers collègues. Est-ce que M. Georges Christian Tuta est en ligne
Romania. A question from Romania.
Yes.
Go ahead. Up to you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again for this wonderful opportunity to speak today in the conference on digital and space. As a member of Romanian Parliament, let me extend my deepest sympathy towards the Ukrainian civilians targeted those days by Russian invaders. The criminal and abusive nature of the aggression can be seen from space. One short remark about space and one brief reflection about digital. In this war, we can see the future deploying in front of our eyes. New private entities such as Starlink play a significant role in the world geopolitics. The internet is no longer a state venture, but a more and more private initiative, especially when the internet has equipment deployed on the orbit. Starlink, a private business, had recently to choose side in a war. It doesn't matter why they did so, why they choose to drive the business this way. It is rather important to see the trends in Starlink way of conduct. More and more, especially in matters of the space, will have to bring to table private owners. This topic will gain increasing visibility in the years to come, as space will become the hottest uncharted battlefield. Between outer space and inner space, we will soon witness metaverse, another uncharted territory led by a private entity. The metaverse will be here shortly, bringing a digital double to almost everything. The tech companies speak about digital twins as virtual replicas of any existing or living around us. A new space to regulate and populate with the good principles. Metaverse will be just one single instance of the virtual world. Many other private entities will innovate more application for the twins virtual world. Till then, we have to think about two things. First of all, we have to make sure the technology is safe, that no one could harm the environment. No one outside the legitimate regulators could interface with the process. Somehow we did bad in the real world. We do not have to dub our mistakes in the virtual world. Second, we have to make sure that individuals are tech educated at a level that allows them to understand the benefits and also the dangers of such new social and technology environment. And I think my time is up. Thank you very much for this opportunity. And
thank you, dear colleague. And you are in Romania, so you're very close to Ukraine. So we are thinking of you also, and you've got our deepest sympathy. Mes chers collègues.
Dear colleagues, is there anyone online who'd like to take the floor, to put a question or to react to what has been said? And give the priority also to those in the room to react, should they so wish. Yes. Perhaps to talk about our industry today and the state of space Europe as compared to our North American competitors. It is true that in new space and the dynamism created around space startups in the US, which are ahead of the pack, let me get things into perspective. We shouldn't forget that within Europe, we've got a space budget which is a lot lower than that of the United States. We've got industrial champions who are ahead of the pack. They're leaders, whether we're talking about Airbus, Thales, a number of sectors, optical observation or telecommunications. And they get most of the contracts in the world. So we've got a very strong setup in Europe. We mustn't lose sight of this. I didn't refer to the launcher sector. The European industry of launchers is the only competitor against Musk. I mean, obviously, we can't really talk about leadership in the launcher sector as it was 15 years ago, whereas now what we're trying to do is actually to catch up the time lag. That's true, there's no denying that, but we mustn't lose sight of the fact, and this is my main message, that we've got a European industry that's really strong. We've got a world of startups that's really active in Europe. Figures were cited by Timo Pesonen earlier on. One startup per week is created in France, simply in France, in the space sector. So I really think that we've got all of the trump cards, and there's a question of ambition, European ambition, as regards the everything is pushing for the public contracts. Everything is in our favor here. Okay, thank you very much. Before I ask the other panelists to speak, we've got another colleague from Romania who has asked for the floor. If you hear us, would you like to come in?
I'm very happy to have the opportunity of being together today and discussing such a challenging topic. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, perfectly.
Okay, that's great. That's great. The past few days have shown us more than ever before maybe that the space is a venue where world's countries showcase their power. Unfortunately, not in the best possible way all the time. Some, and we know who are they, turn into a stage where they unveil unprecedented conflict for the times we live in. We all heard about Dmitry Rogozin's threat that economic sanctions against Russia would result in the International Space Station crashing down, and this is a lot. In our opinion, thus in such circumstances, it's even more important for European countries to join forces to foster trust between member states, to generate innovative programs and become more competitive on an international scale. In this regard, I strongly believe that each country contribution is extremely important and valuable to the Europeans becoming the world space leader, because we are a leader right now, and I'm going to talk later about what I'm referring to. As representative of Romania, I'd like to highlight that my country is developing technologies in the frame of European Space Agency safety program, and it's closely working with international space actors in an extended area of security-related matters, as effective monitoring space and security requires cooperation. The pandemic period, closely followed by the horrible events that are happening right now in Ukraine, it's an evidence of the increase of importance of communications. They showed us how imperative is to stay connected and informed, no matter where we are on the Earth in the end. So it is time to act, to accelerate the space exploratory process by launching maybe more geostationary satellites, or maybe deploying constellation of multiple satellites, as is happening with some of the United States companies. All this technology ensuring a broader and more inclusive coverage for Europe in general. Good internet connection are essential not only for Europe, businesses and countries to remain competitive in the global economy, but also at a larger scale to promote social inclusion. Thus, space systems are critical infrastructure for Europe, and this is something that many international organizations and some countries, including Romania, had acknowledged more than a decade ago, when they started legalizing space as an area of critical infrastructure. On the other hand, let's not forget that for years, Europe is world leader in telecommunication infrastructure through two of our European companies, Ericsson and Nokia. But when talking about new space economy, Europe leaders position its challenge, especially by the US companies like SpaceX, as I said before. Ever since Romania has been intensively involved in all levels in space activities, being now carried by a variety of organizations, public and private, as institutions, universities, industry, SMEs, a number in the end of almost 117 contracts being recorded by the National Space Program. And I'm going to reach the finish saying that carrying on with the example of my country's level of involvement, it's essential to mention that Romania has always made a significant contribution to the activities of ITU, International Telecommunication Union, and you can just see a banner behind me with this, the organization that actually allocate the orbits for satellites. I'm nominating ITU because I take this chance of being together to tell you that this year Romania will host the ITU Plenipotentiary Conference, where I have the chance to be the designated chairman, and it's my pleasure to invite each of you countries delegation to participate in this event, and I'm looking forward to welcoming you, Bucharest. Thank you very much again for this chance, and good luck in every project you are starting. Not only this domain. Thank you again, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, dear colleague, and thank you for respecting the time very, very precisely. I wish the French colleagues were as precise as our Romanian colleagues. My job would be easier. Not today, I'm talking in general. So, on a Monsieur Pascal Le...
Mr. Pascal Leguet, who is security advisor at the ESA, wanted to react, and after that we'll have reactions from here in the room. Can you hear me? Well, I just wanted to make a few very quick observations. The first, as you've said, I represent the European Space Agency. And there are two words we don't use. One is defense and the other is military. Sometimes we take the risk of using the word security, which means helping populations, for instance, who are in difficulty, using spatial means, and sometimes even that security can be perceived by some member states as an attack on their national sovereignty. That's a first observation. The second is on duality of systems. And that's been said by different speakers. Majority of spatial capacity today is dual Copernicus, and or rather Galileo and Copernicus is a security system of SATCOM, space surveillance, launchers also, that's been said, that can also be used to develop ballistic means or dual load. The question which is then posed by duality is not a technical one, it's a political one. Can we use systems which are developed for civil ends militarily? And that often tends to be a one-way street, duality. Civil needs toward military means, but not so much military means for civil ends. That was my second observation. The third concerns the technological dimension. We've talked about industrial, technological, political, and there was one dimension which only Mr. Lecoq brought up, and that was space law, which I think is also essential to push further, because that encourages transparency and trust, and Mr. Lecoq said, and I wish to emphasize the same thing, that there needs to be a binding dimension. The European Union wanted activities in the extra-atmospheric space to have the subject of a binding instrument. People are not wanting to have that regulated. We can understand that, but something needs to be done. And then finally, we talked quite a lot about the United States today. It's the United States who are setting the rules, and the rest of the world follows. Sorry, this bit is not very comprehensible. In Europe, we can't do that because it's a military application we can't touch. Airbus with Pléiade Neo is also marketing this type of thing. And we've also talked about commercializing space surveillance services. This happens a lot in the United States. So probably in Europe, we'll need to be a bit bolder, more courageous in going further and not allowing others to impose rules on us. Thank you. Mr. Pasca, would you like to answer? React. Yes, very quickly. On the issue of defense and security, which has been brought up by some of your colleagues at the very beginning, just 2 points that I wanted to make. I think we're walking on 2 feet here. The first leg is resistance, resilience, making this task more difficult for the adversary. And this goes back, of course, to technology like miniaturization, proliferation of systems, which make this thing more difficult. But it's also about certain working paths forward. And some of these we're seeing now. Pascal Leguet mentioned them. For instance, the military-civil axis, whose precursors have already been much used, the European international axis as well, how we can strengthen things, shore things up by adding things to a national core. And then the last axis, which covers a bit everything, is the public-commercial axis. And here again, public authorities and government will certainly find it to be in their interest to invent new ways and means of relating with each other. It's not easy. The United States are simulating this in games to see how they could best benefit from these new systems which are being born and which could serve the public interest and are not necessarily antagonistic. That's the first thing I wanted to say. The second axis is to impose costs on the adversary. And here we talked about the applicability of these rules, and here again, the Americans in the English-speaking world, we call this enforcement. And what are we really talking about? I think the first European investment, and that was well said in Europe recently, is to invest in a situation that allows us to know what the situation is in space. Today, we find it hard to know what is the cause of things breaking down, why certain problems happen. And that creates a situation of shared rules, which has to do with the control of traffic, but we also need to add in such a way that this is adopted by everyone and that it's a reference. And are we going toward a code of conduct? Opinions seem to diverge, and that blocks the discussion. I don't know about naming and shaming. That happened with satellite scrambling. A Romanian colleague has already, I think, mentioned some of these aspects, something that works today in communication, and I think we would need to extend that to other areas as well. Then finally, we come to a point which is like France's spatial defense strategy, which could illustrate this. The legitimacy or otherwise of all of this. We see that there's more and more tension in space, and we can recognize that it would be legitimate. We could regret it, but all countries want to protect themselves. It's even an obligation. But if we do that, we have to do it responsibility and transparently. There are mechanisms of arms control in the arms race in space. We would have to be very diplomatic, and I think we can be inspired by what happens elsewhere and extrapolate that to space also. Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Belvisi, would you like to say something? Very quickly, perhaps. Thanks very much. I think that what I've seen today in our discussion shows that there has been an exchange of views, and there is real awareness of the strong points and expertise of European players, but I think it's particularly important in terms of leadership in spatial economy. And I think this is what we see what we haven't gotten, what we haven't done, and it's on that basis that we'll be able to put forward the policy of tomorrow. I think we can all agree on the fact that there's very strong European will to strengthen our presence in space, to have mechanisms to fund new space, to cooperate with established players, to have strategic guidelines developed that would be used in Europe, to have necessary funding of these. But I think that today what we see is that, well, China and the United States have gone forth to conquer this new world. And what is the European vision? What do we see? How do we see tomorrow's world? How will this be built in space? And what can Europe contribute to all of that? Thank you. And before I let my colleague Françoise Dumas conclude, I'd like to thank everyone who contributed to the organization of this meeting, our interpreters, those I can see around me and above me. And we see the technology has worked, even if it doesn't always work, as we see with spatial concerns as well. Error is human, and systems do not always work. Thank you. Madam Chairman, dear friends, thank you, Mr. Chairman, dear Hollande and Madam Chair. I have the pleasure of concluding and very warmly thanking each of you for your participation in this fascinating discussion. And we can also see who this technical personnel is to allow this discussion to happen. Even if we have, and here I need to repeat what Pierre Gaboret has said, We had done everything to welcome you to Toulouse, which is my region, our region, and we would so much have liked letting you get to know Occitanie, the region around Toulouse, but that's the way things are. I know we all share the conviction that up there in space, a fundamental aspect of our ability to remain a power and to have a prosperous and autonomous economy is there. And I think we have to act as quickly as possible to that end. I think we have heard discussions of the daily difficulties people encounter, of worldwide competition, of rising threats, but I think that unfortunately more than ever before, we feel all these things. I think we also all agree to say that in such demanding areas we need unique expertise of different forms, and we will only be able to act effectively if we act together, united between Europeans, companies from different countries, between big historic groups. We've already heard some of this, but also startups that are very innovative and very promising that give us so much hope. No other actors should be neglected, so if we want to stay in the race, we've understood that, and I'm very happy that our discussions today have allowed each and every one of us to measure these challenges more accurately, and I think we see how urgent things are, and I think we see very clearly in these last days that our common fate is being built at an accelerated speed, and that international crises, if they were not as cruel as they are, could help us to become more dynamic. And they oblige us very rapidly to build and rebuild an even more solidarity form of Europe, which has got even more brotherhood, and space can and should help us to do this. I thank you very much for your attention, and I thank all of you from the bottom of my heart for this excellent exchange that we had this afternoon, and which I hope will be one of many to follow. Thank you all very much. I wish you an excellent end of the day. Thank you very much.
Merci.